Life presents everyone with moments when they must make difficult choices, especially in youth when life experience is lacking. This is the very dilemma the main character of this story found herself in. Being very young, she ended up at the center of a love triangle, not realizing how dangerous it could be. Unfortunately, the girl didn't have time to grasp the full gravity of her situation. 19-year-old Cayley Mandadi was a sophomore at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. She was in a relationship with 22-year-old Mark Howerton, but at the same time continued to maintain a connection with her ex-boyfriend Jet Burcham. Cayley met Mark while still dating Jet, and for a long time hesitated about which of them to choose. On October 29, 2017, Cayley and Mark attended an annual music festival in San Antonio. There, the young couple drank alcohol and smoked marijuana, then engaged in consensual sexual intercourse. After this, the girls suddenly lost consciousness. Mark noticed that she stopped breathing, so without wasting a second, he put her in the car and raced to the nearest hospital. The medics made every effort to save Cayley's life, using various methods and equipment, but unfortunately to no avail. Later, the doctors officially declared the death of the young cheerleader as a result of her injuries. And there were many of them, which shocked the girl's mother when she first saw her daughter in the hospital. The woman got the impression that Cayley had either been thrown off a bridge or jumped out of a plane herself, so mutilated was her body. Cayley was brought to the hospital in an extremely critical condition. At least 7 times, the medics performed artificial respiration on the girl and were able to get her heart started, but each time it stopped again. Cayley fell into a coma, so to sustain her life, she was connected to special equipment. The doctors fought for the girl's life for 2 days, but eventually it became clear that Cayley's brain was no longer functioning. The medics had to inform the patient's parents that there was no hope of recovery. So the decision was made to disconnect Cayley from the ventilator. The family insisted on fulfilling the girl's last wish. She had always wanted that in the event of a tragedy, her organs be donated to save other people's lives. The parents stayed by their daughter's side until the very end and could not believe the reality of what was happening. But unfortunately, it was true, the young student passed away without ever regaining consciousness. The cause of Cayley's death, according to the forensic experts, was a traumatic brain injury. Fractures of the skull and collarbone were found, inflicted by a blunt object. Moreover, the girl's face was so disfigured that it seemed as if some monster, not a human, had mutilated her. The family simply could not believe it. At the time of the tragedy, Cayley Mandadi had just turned 19. She was a sophomore in the Public Relations Department at Trinity University. Cayley was a bright and popular girl who was respected in the university's female community. She was part of the cheerleading squad. Cayley had charm and charisma, so she easily made friends, was sociable, and quickly found common ground with any company, arousing general admiration. Cayley's best friend said that the girl was interested not only in studying, she strived to build a personal life and loved to have fun. Immediately after entering university, Cayley fell in love with her first boyfriend, Jet Burcham. This feeling became her first deep love, which she then could not forget in any way. Cayley and Jet met in their freshman year. The young man was a talented athlete, and a spark immediately flared up between them. Cayley considered Jet her dream and was very proud of their relationship. However, as the deceased girl's mother noted, it was more of a typical infatuation between 2 teenagers. The couple had occasional disagreements, with feelings fading and then flaring up again. Cayley's plans included starting her own family and having children. Already in her sophomore year, she was sure that Jet shared her aspirations. But later, The girl began to feel that her chosen one was too frivolous about life and did not think about the future. Realizing this, Cayley decided to move on. It was during this period that she met Mark Howerton. Although he was not a student at Trinity University, he had friends there. There was an immediate mutual attraction between Cayley and Mark. They quickly found common ground and began dating. However, the girl never completely broke off her relationship with Jet, so she actually started a romance with two guys at once. Moreover, both Mark and Jet knew about each other's existence, and it seemed as if Cayley had set up some kind of competition, intending to choose the best of them. Both young men disapproved of the girl's experiments and insisted that she finally make up her mind. However, Cayley did not have time to resolve this love triangle. Literally a month after Mark appeared in her life, the girl was hospitalized with life-threatening injuries. This happened on October 29, 2017, at about 10:30 p.m. That's when Mark Howerton brought Cayley to the medical facility in his car. While the doctors were making every effort to save the victim's life, law enforcement officers had already arrived at the scene and began talking to 22-year-old Mark. To have a conversation in a calmer setting, they took the young man to the quietest place they could find within the walls of the medical facility, the hospital chapel. According to Mark, he and the girl spent the weekend at a music festival in San Antonio. There, the young people drank alcohol and smoked marijuana. As the cops found out, this leisure scenario was a common thing for the couple. Mark reported that between 5 and 6 p.m., they left the festival and drove off in his Mercedes. During this car ride, an argument broke out between the lovers, triggered by Cayley's confession that she still had feelings for her ex-boyfriend Jet. Mark tried to convince the girl to break off her relationship with her former lover and stop all communication with his circle. Eventually, he managed to calm Cayley down, and she promised to think about it. Later, the couple stopped near the nearest gas station and engaged in intimate relations. According to Mark, the sex between them was quite rough. He squeezed the girl's neck with his hands and slapped her face, but as the young man claimed, Cayley enjoyed such intense sensations. Despite the police officers' attempts to latch onto these details, Mark insisted that everything happened by mutual consent. But on that fateful evening, something went wrong. According to the young man, after intercourse, they talked for about 5 more minutes, and then Cayley began complaining of a headache. Mark didn't think much of it, assuming that the girl had simply overdone it with the alcohol and weed. But just a few seconds later, she suddenly passed out and started snoring, yet even at that moment Mark didn't become alarmed. Instead, he decided to take Cayley to his apartment in Houston, thinking that she had simply fallen asleep due to fatigue and the influence of psychoactive substances. At some point, the girl stopped snoring and showing any signs of life at all, which made Mark wary. Only then did he feel uneasy. The young man felt for a pulse on Cayley's neck, but, as it seemed to him, the girl's heart was no longer beating and she wasn't breathing. After that, Mark rushed to the hospital as quickly as possible, worried about his girlfriend's condition. The detectives who undertook to investigate this case were convinced that the horrific injuries on the deceased's body indicated a brutal beating. They repeatedly interrogated Mark but had nothing to go on. The only discrepancy in his testimony concerned where exactly the couple was immediately before the tragedy. At first, Mark claimed that they were spending time at the gas station, and then admitted that they had driven to a deserted parking lot behind the gas station, but overall this detail did not compromise the young man in any way. Mark did not confess to murder, and there was a lack of concrete evidence against him, so the young man was released without charges being filed. However, he still remained the prime suspect, as no one believed his story. It was obvious that the girl had been mercilessly beaten before her death. The situation changed dramatically only 3 months later, when a full report came in from the expert who conducted the autopsy. In his opinion, the cause of Cayley's death was blunt force trauma to the face and head, so the incident was reclassified as intentional homicide. On this basis, Mark was arrested on February 28, 2018, and charged with kidnapping, murder, and rape. However, the suspect denied his guilt, and some time later he was released on bail pending trial. It might have seemed that this would be a fairly simple case, as there was no doubt about who the deceased girl was spending time with. But the deeper the police delved into the intricacies of this story, analyzing the suspect's personality, as well as details from the victim's life, the more they unraveled a whole tangle of fatal mistakes that ultimately led Cayley to the autopsy table. Mark's relatives immediately hired a lawyer to defend, as they believed, the young man's innocence. The defender was convinced that his client had been subjected to repression undeservedly. In his opinion, the charges brought were the result of negligence and carelessness on the part of the investigators. The lawyer argued that Mark was not involved in the girl's murder, and her injuries could have been the result of a fall at the music festival or sustained as a result of the resuscitation measures taken by the medics to save the victim's life. The work of law enforcement was significantly complicated by the fact that, despite the large crowd at the concert where the tragedy occurred, they were unable to find even a single witness to the event. The defender of the main suspect insisted that his client could not have committed murder, as his overall behavior did not correspond to the typical model of a criminal's actions. After all, instead of trying to hide traces of the crime and get rid of the body, Mark immediately took the victim to the hospital, seeking to get her help. Of course, the goal of the defense was to create the most positive image of the defendant. And to the prosecution's misfortune, the suspect's lawyer turned out to be an outstanding professional with extensive experience in such cases. 2 years had passed since the tragic death of Cayley Mandadi, and only in December 2019 did Mark Howerton face trial on charges of her murder. The prosecution assumed that on October 29, 2017, the defendant forcibly dragged the student into his car, thus abducting her from the music festival. Then, according to the prosecution, the young man took the girl to a deserted parking lot behind the gas station. It was there that an argument broke out between them, the reason for which was Mark's jealousy of another guy. In a fit of rage, Howerton raped Cayley and brutally beat her, causing a cerebral hemorrhage and, as a result, irreversible processes in her body. And when the victim stopped showing any signs of life, the young man, frightened, tried to save the situation and raced to the hospital. Mark cherished the hope that the medics would be able to resuscitate the girl, which is why he went to the medical facility. However, in the opinion of the suspect's lawyer, the prosecution's version was wrong from beginning to end, starting with the allegation of kidnapping and ending with the accusations of beating. The prosecution indeed did not have a single witness who could confirm the assumption that the girl was forcibly put into the car and taken from the festival. The defender insisted that the bruises and other injuries on Cayley's body could have appeared as a result of the active resuscitation measures taken by the medics in an attempt to save her life. After all, it is known that the doctors tried to bring the girl back to consciousness at least 7 times before realizing the futility of these efforts. Unfortunately, the only person who could confirm or refute the defendant's words was already dead. And although the version about Cayley being injured by medical personnel seemed rather absurd, the prosecutor was forced to refute all, even the least likely options for how the girl received bodily injuries, which Howerton's lawyer so insisted on. But this required witnesses who could at least partially reconstruct the events of that fatal evening. So, the investigators first of all questioned the ambulance workers who came to the call to save the student. Their ambulance was parked nearby in the medical facility's parking lot, waiting for the next call. Suddenly, behind them, some car stopped with a sharp brake, which immediately attracted the attention of the medics. They saw a young man who was desperately waving his hand and begging them to come over. It was none other than Mark Howerton. When the paramedics ran up, the guy showed them an unconscious girl in the passenger seat of his car who was no longer breathing, and desperately begged for help. Looking into Mark's car, the medics became even more wary. Cayley was lying completely naked on the passenger seat, her clothes were scattered in disarray on the floor at her feet. The girl was unconscious. But what struck the doctors the most was something else. The victim's entire body was covered in bruises, with clear traces of hematomas visible even on the inner surface of her thighs. The medics immediately set about performing artificial respiration and indirect cardiac massage on Cayley. The testimony of the paramedics made it possible to expose the falsity of the suspect's claims that he did not beat his girlfriend. After all, when Mark had just brought Cayley to the hospital, the bruises all over her body were already present. Thus, the improbable version put forward by the defense turned out to be, as initially assumed, a complete slander. It also became clear at the medical facility that Howerton had informed the doctors that Cayley had overdosed. The young man admitted that over the weekend, they had been actively using drugs and alcohol together. But during the examination of the deceased's body, no symptoms characteristic of overdose or poisoning were found. While providing first aid to the girl, someone from the medical staff took several photos of Mark, the same young man who had brought Cayley to the hospital. Several people immediately noticed his excessively red fists. It seemed as if the guy had been fighting with someone for a long time just before that. Howerton was quite muscular in general. Many of his acquaintances and relatives confirmed that Mark was an avid gym-goer and constantly used steroids. However, during the 2 years that he spent under supervision while awaiting trial, the guy had lost so much weight that he became completely unlike his former self. This only confirmed the suspicions about the use of anabolic steroids to gain muscle mass. But it is well known that such drugs often cause sharp mood swings, uncontrolled outbursts of aggression, and loss of self-control. That is why they often lead to assaults or provoke confrontational behavior. Therefore, Cayley could indeed have inadvertently provoked her lover's furious anger with just one word. At first, Mark showed his full willingness to cooperate with the investigation and even allowed a search of his car without a warrant. In it, the detectives found a gun and narcotics. Howerton's defender immediately latched onto this fact as an argument in favor of his client's innocence. He claimed that no real criminal would ever go for such active contact with law enforcement. However, the prosecution continued to stand its ground. The prosecutor was convinced that Mark had beaten Cayley to death, that's why numerous bruises remained on the girl's body. To support this version, the prosecution provided photographs from the hospital that recorded many bruises already at the stage of hospitalization, before any medical manipulations were carried out. The clinic staff confirmed that all these injuries were already present immediately after the victim was brought to the medical facility. So in light of all this, Mark's confession about rough sex seemed unconvincing at the very least. But at the same time, it suggested the possibility of rape. The prosecutors quickly saw through the suspect's tactics. In their opinion, the demonstrative readiness to cooperate with the investigation was only a way to divert suspicion from his own person. The defense, in turn, insisted that similar injuries could have appeared on the girl as a result of the resuscitation measures taken by the doctors. And although the medics did not deny such a possibility regarding minor hematomas, they continued to maintain that by the time Cayley arrived at the clinic, there were already many serious injuries on her body. Moreover, it is unlikely that minor bruises would lead to a lethal outcome, because the girl's death occurred as a result of a severe traumatic brain injury, which the medical staff could not have inflicted in any way. Cayley Mandadi died at the hands of her lover, and to prove this, the prosecutors decided to dwell in more detail on the difficult relationship between Mark Howerton and the deceased. One of Cayley's closest friends admitted, shortly before the tragic denouement, she herself witnessed a horrifying incident. Jealous Mark was against his girlfriend going to a party, but Cayley ignored it and still went to hang out. When she returned home with her friend, an enraged Howerton was waiting for her. In a fit of rage, he grabbed the girl and with all his strength threw her against the wall. At the same time, Mark threatened that the next time he would definitely smash Cayley's face if she did it again. He also promised to cause serious harm to his beloved if she even talked to another guy. Despite the cruelty of this incident, Cayley did not suffer any visible injuries then and did not go to the police. However, her best friend considered Howerton's behavior abnormal and tried in every possible way to convince Mandadi herself of this. However, she surprisingly calmly reacted to her boyfriend's outburst. So the friend concluded that for Mark, such outbursts of aggression were more of a pattern than an exception. Several people testified about the young man's violent temper. But the defendant's lawyer skillfully used the opposite reviews as well. Howerton's ex-girlfriend said that he never allowed himself to be aggressive towards them. But there was one nuance here: Mark dated these girls before he started using steroids. On the other hand, the guy's friends and acquaintances claimed that it was precisely after starting the anabolic course that he became hot-tempered and irritable. Mark would get into some kind of conflict over and over again, and often provoked them himself, which was not noticed behind him before. However, all these metamorphoses did not have any particular consequences until the tragic trip to the music festival. But even before that, during one of Mark's quarrels with Cayley, the neighbors even called the police. When law enforcement officers arrived on the call, Howerton for some reason categorically forbade them to inspect Mandadi's room, where he was at that time. Although in fact, the girl herself rented this dwelling, and she was not there at that moment. The investigators suspected that Cayley had run away from home for a reason. Later, she did return, and the conflict seemed to be quickly settled. However, the police were alarmed by the deplorable state of the room in the dormitory where the student lived. The balcony door was shattered, furniture overturned and broken, a laptop smashed, and clothes hanging haphazardly on the trees near the building. Howerton, in a fit of rage, had trashed everything there, for which he was even banned from appearing on the campus grounds for a while. Cayley's friend was convinced that this conflict marked the final breakup of the relationship between the lovers. The girl no longer wanted to see or talk to Mark, and even ignored his calls. But later, the couple made up again. The prosecutors presented the couple's correspondence from messengers in court. The text of the messages clearly indicated how painfully the boyfriend reacted to the very thought of breaking up. In one of them, Mark sent a creepy selfie, putting a gun to his temple. He threatened to end his life if Cayley did not call. With such manipulations, he sought to pressure the girl. As a result of all this, Mandadi found herself drawn into a dangerous relationship triangle. Even before the described events, she had told her ex-boyfriend Jet that she finally realized her mistake and would like to return to him. But after seeing that alarming photo later, Cayley sincerely feared that Howerton might really do something to himself. And this allowed the guy to manipulate his passion. Mandadi herself repeatedly confessed that she was in love with both young men and simply could not make a choice. Only Mark's aggressive antics made her think about ending the relationship with him. However, he put all kinds of pressure on Cayley and did everything to keep her with him. And for a while, these manipulations worked. In October 2017, at a music festival, Mandadi told Jet that she was breaking off her romantic relationship with Mark. As a farewell, she even agreed to go to the concert with Howerton, because she feared that left alone with her, the unbalanced guy would again lose control of himself. However, in the presence of a large crowd, the girl felt quite safe. Heading to the festival, Mark stopped along the way to pick up another friend, so the three of them set off together. But not long before reaching their destination, the company stopped for a while on the sidelines. There, the young men, away from prying eyes, smoked marijuana. And even after arriving at the venue, they continued to use weed along with alcohol. One of the witnesses, who was also hanging out with Mark and Cayley at the time, said that at some point another conflict erupted between the couple. In the end, Mandadi couldn't stand it and stated that she was dumping her boyfriend. After this incident, an irritated Mark dragged the girl towards his car, and, as their mutual friend noticed, he did it against her will. From that ill-fated evening, Cayley never returned to her dorm room. Her best friend immediately suspected that the girl was in trouble, and that Howerton was involved in this. As it later turned out, these fears were justified. However, at that moment, no one yet knew that Mandadi was in the hospital, where medics were desperately trying to save her life. And when the frightened girlfriends contacted Mark, he lied to them, claiming that Cayley had simply fallen asleep and could not talk at the moment. However, the guy did not say a word that at this very moment his beloved's life was hanging by a thread. During the court hearing, Jet, Cayley's first boyfriend, also testified in the case. He said that he was also at that festival and saw the conflict with Mark with his own eyes. Jet decided not to intervene in the quarrel, because the girl herself asked him not to do it. She was determined to finally sever all ties with Mark and did not want to escalate the situation once again. Cayley believed that she would be able to persuade her manipulative boyfriend to leave her alone once and for all, and then everything would be fine. When Jet, like the rest of Cayley's friends, failed to find the missing girl, he began actively searching the student dormitory where she lived during her studies. But no trace of Mandadi was found there either. Only later did university friends learn the terrible truth: the student had died in the hospital, never recovering from the consequences of severe head injuries. At the trial, it was Jet Burcham who turned out to be a key witness for the prosecution. It was only thanks to his testimony that the prosecutors had good reason to charge Mark Howerton with rape, kidnapping, and murder all at once. However, the defendant's lawyer acted remarkably professionally. He tried with all his might to whitewash his client, and time after time exposed Jet for false statements. In particular, it soon became apparent that this main witness did not actually see with his own eyes how the accused forcibly put Cayley into his car. Although at first, Burcham claimed that he personally observed Howerton dragging the girl to the car despite her resistance. This discrepancy surfaced after several clarifying questions. Why, then, did Jet not intervene and prevent the abduction if he really witnessed it? It turns out that at that moment Mandadi and Mark had already disappeared from Burcham's field of vision. So in fact, the guy did not catch the moment of Cayley getting into the car, but only heard about it from acquaintances, but could not name specific names. All these facts gave good reason to suspect the young man of false testimony and dealt a devastating blow to the prosecution's case. Now, in the eyes of the jury, Jet no longer looked like a reliable witness, which greatly undermined confidence in his testimony in general. Moreover, during the investigation, photographs of drugs, suspicious contacts, and correspondence were found on Burcham's mobile phone. All this suggested his unhealthy passion for illegal substances. As it turned out, at the time of Cayley's death, he was just on probation, as he had been detained as a well-known marijuana supplier in San Antonio. Jet was subjected to a merciless cross-examination, during which the guy refused to answer the questions of Howerton's lawyer at all, which, however, was his legal right. However, the virtuoso tactics of the defense actually drove the witness into a corner, forcing him to resort to self-justification. And this despite the fact that the prosecution guaranteed Burcham full immunity from criminal prosecution in exchange for honest testimony. Therefore, his behavior looked extremely suspicious, as if he was really involved in some shady business, but in every possible way avoided drawing the attention of the prosecution to them. The atmosphere in the courtroom was getting increasingly heated. Mark's defender even managed to dig up that Jet had problems with the law before. Not long before the incident with Cayley, he was expelled from the university due to accusations of harassment against one of the students, who wrote a statement against him to the police. Although the conflict was eventually settled, and the case did not reach serious consequences, voluntary expulsion from the university was still necessary. An independent forensic expert and several other specialists suggested that the head injury that led to the hemorrhage and ultimately proved fatal was actually absent at the time the girl arrived at the medical facility. They believed that Cayley could have received it later, already during an accidental fall in the hospital. However, such a version in no way explained why Mandadi lost consciousness at all and ended up in the hospital. After all, the reason for seeking help was the craniocerebral injury itself. Another final argument of the lawyer was the fact that bruises all over the body could have appeared as a result of preparing the deceased for posthumous organ donation, which she personally insisted on during her lifetime. But all these assumptions sounded strange at the very least, especially given the suspect's reddened fists, which indicated a recent fight. Based on the information about the nature of the injuries Cayley received, a 3D model was created, and then, with the involvement of actors of similar build in the same car, the course of events was recreated. In this way, the prosecution tried to prove to the jury the violent nature of the victim's death. In addition, a toxicological examination revealed a high content of substances capable of increasing blood pressure in the blood of the deceased. And this, in turn, significantly increased the risk of internal hemorrhages and ruptures of blood vessels. Medics involved by the defense confirmed, against the background of all the circumstances that emerged during the investigation, even a relatively mild head injury could well provoke serious bleeding. But the prosecutors were adamant, in their opinion, Cayley's death occurred as a result of premeditated murder. Such a version was primarily evidenced by the specific biography of the accused, as well as the girl's skull fracture, which could not have been caused by the action of psychoactive substances in any way. The first hearing in the case was surprisingly nervous, after which the jury went to deliberate in order to determine the verdict. And just a few hours later, the defense received a shocking phone call. A new unexpected witness contacted the lawyer. This man confessed that he saw the actual condition the deceased was in when she was first brought to the medical center. After all, on that fatal night, he was just on duty at the hospital reception. And according to this witness, when Cayley was just brought to the hospital, there were no bruises on her body at all. He suggested that the hematomas could have appeared later as a result of internal bleeding that developed due to prolonged interruptions in the work of the heart and preparation of the body for organ removal for transplantation. Everyone expected that confirmation of these words could completely remove all charges from Mark Howerton. But, as the judge explained, at this stage of the process, the law no longer allowed the testimony of new witnesses to be included in the case. The deliberation of the verdict dragged on for a whole 10 hours and lasted 2 days. The jurors could not come to a common opinion and make a final decision in any way. Obviously, the available information was not enough to fully satisfy the thirst for justice on the part of the deceased's relatives. So in the end, the servants of Themis recognized that the first trial was conducted with procedural violations, and scheduled a retrial in the case. Despite such a twist, both sides declared their readiness to continue to defend their position until justice was achieved. The defense planned to seek a review of the case, emphasizing the newly discovered insincerity of Jet Bertram's testimony and the unexpected appearance of a new witness. Meanwhile, the parents of the deceased continued to insist that they did not doubt Howerton's guilt for a moment. In the end, the prosecution did indeed re-indict Mark Howerton. In June 2023, a new trial began, this time behind closed doors for the media, so many details remained behind the scenes. Back in 2018, the young man faced life imprisonment if his guilt in committing premeditated murder could be proven. During the second trial, the qualification of the crime was changed to assault under aggravating circumstances. The prosecutors brought in a new expert, a domestic violence specialist who told the jury about the typical signs of an abuser. In his opinion, Mark fit this profile. He sought to isolate Cayley from her entourage, was morbidly jealous, and constantly resorted to manipulation. And in the end, he completely lost self-control in a fit of blind rage. The specialist emphasized, the 19-year-old girl, due to her young age, had no idea what a dangerous person she was involved with and what trouble she had gotten into. And again, fierce debates broke out in the courtroom about how exactly Cayley got her injuries. Howerton's defense failed to involve a new key witness, while the prosecutor's arguments were more convincing. Despite the fact that the young man denied his involvement to the last, the jury found him guilty of the murder of Cayley Mandadi. The sentence was the maximum severity. Mark was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Jessie Bardwell was a true daddy's girl. The young woman sincerely adored her father Gary, and they shared a special bond. The man also loved his daughter with all his heart. She was the most precious thing in the world to him. Their relationship was characterized by incredible warmth, absolute mutual understanding, and support. The protagonist of this story was an exceptionally pretty, charming, and pleasant girl. During the period in question, she lived in a small resort town called Orange Beach, Alabama, USA. Jessie worked as a waitress in one of the most popular restaurants in the city. But eventually, the girl decided to move to Texas. This decision came as a complete surprise to her father. He saw no good reasons for such a drastic change in his daughter's life. However, Jessie simply explained that she needed to clear her head and change her surroundings. She planned to leave for just a couple of weeks. At first, the girl regularly kept in touch, but gradually, the situation became increasingly alarming. When about 6 months had passed, Jessie stopped giving any news at all. The girl's close friends became worried, but it was her father who had to endure the worst. One night, he woke up drenched in cold sweat. Gary had a terrifying nightmare, after which he was convinced that his daughter was in mortal danger. Jessie's friend named Kimberly knew more about the girl's trip than she had told her father. She was aware that Jessie was going to Texas long before she confessed it to her family. As it turned out, the girl had met a young man there who seemed incredibly attractive to her. The more they communicated, the stronger their feelings for each other grew. Eventually, the heroine of this story dared to go to him. The couple planned to develop their relationship, so Jessie decided to temporarily move in with her boyfriend. But in any case, she intended to return home. The father eagerly awaited his daughter day after day, hoping that his beloved girl would soon walk through the door with her luggage. He desperately wanted her to come back, but Jessie never showed up. The birth of Jessie and her older brother had been a true blessing for their parents. The couple had long dreamed of having children but couldn't conceive. The arrival of a girl and a boy turned their long-held hopes into reality. At that time, the man worked as a firefighter in the Mississippi State Service. A special bond immediately formed between him and his daughter. From a young age, Jessie always singled out her father among all other relatives, worried about him, and constantly called to find out when Daddy would return home from work. They lived as one big, close-knit family, Mom, Dad, Jessie, and her older brother Brandon. But unfortunately, over time, the family began to fall apart. When the girl was in school, a serious conflict arose between her parents. When Jessie turned 14, the couple decided to divorce. The girl chose to stay with her father, as she was very close to him, while her brother went to live with their mother. Some time later, Gary found a new life partner named Gina and married her. This woman became a wonderful stepmother to Jessie. They instantly developed a fondness for each other. The relationships within the family resembled true harmony. After graduating from school, Jessie, who had a strong-willed character, the girl got a job at a coastal restaurant called Cobalt to earn a living. She planned to attend college and get an education, so she began saving money. Jessie dreamed that after obtaining her diploma, she would be able to open her own business in the beauty industry. But all this required substantial investments that the girl could not afford. Nevertheless, she did not give up, inspired by her dream. While working at the restaurant, Jessie befriended Kimberly, the manager of the establishment. The girl told her friend that her father had musical talent. So Gary was invited to play at the restaurant one evening. Gradually, the man began performing there regularly. His beloved daughter worked in the same place, which brought them even closer together. At that point, Jessie had already been dating a guy named Terry for quite some time. They had a calm, serious relationship. But suddenly, the girl felt a new infatuation. One evening, Jason Lowe visited the restaurant, and a spark immediately ignited between him and Jessie. This new acquaintance was very attractive, had 2 university degrees, and grand ambitions. Soon, the young people started dating. For the heroine of this story, Jason became not just an object of infatuation but an example of how one can radically change one's life. The young man worked in a large IT company. As he told her, although he came from a simple family, thanks to his abilities and hard work, he began earning 6-figure sums. Jessie realized that this promising guy could help her fulfill her cherished dream of having her own beauty business. Jessie had long wanted to start her own business, but she lacked the funds. When she shared her plans with Jason, he willingly supported her startup idea. The young man said he would help solve the financial issue, but on one condition: they had to live together in Texas. At first, the girl hesitated, not wanting to leave her beloved father. But in the end, Jessie decided to pursue her dream and embark on a small adventure. Jessie carefully planned the move, keeping her intentions secret from her father. She was afraid to tell him about her long-term plans, understanding that he would be categorically against such a decision. During their last joint Christmas celebration, Gary had no idea that his daughter intended to move in with her new boyfriend. Later, the man admitted that he would have done everything possible to prevent this trip and not let Jessie go. Obviously, the girl realized this, so seeking to avoid her father's resistance, she made up a story about a short-term journey. In May 2016, 27-year-old Jessie found herself in the Texas city of Richardson, a suburb of Dallas. Her boyfriend had the opportunity to work remotely from home, while the girl actively searched for a new job and a place where she could open her own beauty salon. From that time on, Jessie's relationship with her father underwent a dramatic change. They began to drift apart. This was only the first alarming sign in a series of events that turned Gary's worst fears into reality. Within just a few days, it became extremely difficult to contact his daughter. Later, from a friend, the man learned that Jessie had a new boyfriend, for whom she had left for another state. Gary began to dig deeper and found out that this young man completely controlled his daughter's cell phone, listened to all her calls, and read her messages. The only way to communicate with Jessie was through calls directly to her boyfriend, Jason. After each such conversation, the guy promised that the girl would call her father back. And indeed, after some time, she would contact Gary. This was the only way they managed to maintain at least some contact. 2 months of such strained relations passed before Gary finally had the chance to personally meet his daughter's boyfriend. Jessie came to visit her father together with her new chosen one. Moved by the reunion, Gary tried to persuade his daughter not to return to Texas, hugging her tighter than usual. But the girl did not want to listen to anything, believing it necessary to go to Dallas with her beloved to fulfill her dream. Gary had no doubts about the true nature of this young man, but it was impossible to convince his daughter of this. When the lovers were leaving, the man was haunted by an oppressive premonition. He shared his fears with Jessie over the phone, but she only asked her father not to worry. As it turned out, in Texas, everything went completely differently than planned. The guy's real financial status was much more modest than he had previously claimed, so the dreams of opening a beauty salon remained just dreams. Jason earned a decent income, but it was not the millions he had boasted about to the girl, throwing dust in her eyes. His constant lies eventually led to quarrels and conflicts between the lovers. For months after moving to Texas, Jessie stopped contacting her father altogether. During this period, Gary called Jason almost every day, persistently demanding to talk to his daughter. However, the young man's response stunned him. Jason claimed that he had no idea where Jessie had disappeared to or what had happened to her. Allegedly, they had a free relationship, and one fine day, the girl simply walked away. Her partner's disappearance supposedly shocked him just as much, and he asked to be notified as soon as Jessie returned home. The guy pretended to be waiting for her, but the father did not believe these words at all. Gary knew well that his daughter had never held such views on relationships, while Jason was actually terribly jealous and constantly monitored the girl's every move. Such guys do not let their chosen ones go just like that. When Jessie did not even call her stepmother or birth mother on Mother's Day to congratulate them on the holiday, it was the last straw for Gary. He knew that his daughter had always been very sensitive about such things. The only reason she could have ignored this important date was serious trouble. The father was convinced that Jessie had gotten into trouble. The very next morning, Gary packed his things, firmly intending to go to Texas in search of his daughter. The man was filled with determination and fury, as he had no doubt that Jason Lowe was directly involved in her disappearance. When the angry father arrived at the house where the lovers lived, he could not find any trace of Jessie's presence. There were no personal belongings of the girl in the dwelling, and Jason continued to insist that he knew nothing and was simply waiting for her return. Then Gary decided to turn to the police. Given all the circumstances of the disappearance, law enforcement reacted immediately. Within a day of receiving the statement, they interrogated Jason several times, trying to find at least some clues, and thoroughly searched the couple's house. However, no traces of Jessie were found. The girls seemed to have vanished into thin air. This clearly contradicted Jason's words that she had just left for a short while and was supposed to return. According to the young man, the last time he saw Jessie was on the morning of May 8, around 10 o'clock. Then she got into her car and drove away, and there had been no news of her since. The police repeatedly spoke with the boyfriend of the missing girl. He claimed that they had a loving but non-committal relationship. Allegedly, Jason did not restrict the girl's freedom and allowed her to live her own life, receiving the same from her. This arrangement suited both of them. At the same time, the guy stated that he was eagerly awaiting the return of his beloved, as her disappearance had been a terrible blow to him. In the house where Jason lived, the police could not find anything suspicious. The young man appeared upset and willingly cooperated with the investigation. According to him, on the day Jessie disappeared, she drove away in her Acura SUV. The story sounded complicated and confusing, but the details about the vehicle raised particular questions. The thing is, the girl had sold her car 3 days before she went missing. Finding this vehicle with the new owner was no trouble for law enforcement. The man unhesitatingly allowed them to inspect the car's interior. However, even there, they could not find anything suspicious or any traces of Jessie. Then the law enforcement officers decided to return to the main suspect's home. The investigators wanted to ask him additional questions, particularly regarding the discrepancies in his statements about the car. On what basis could the young man lie about an already sold vehicle? The detectives visited Jason's house again. During the second search, they quickly understood why the suspect had been dishonest with them. As soon as the investigators crossed the threshold of his room, their attention was immediately drawn to a line of suspicious powder lying on the bedside table. Further examination confirmed that it was indeed an illegal substance. Since the detectives knew that Jason used his own car, they requested to inspect it. As soon as the forensic experts entered the garage, they were immediately hit with the incomparable smell of decomposition. The source of the stench turned out to be the trunk of a black Audi belonging to Jason. The police suspected that there might be a body inside the car, but their fears were not confirmed. It was empty. However, in the car's interior, there was a distinct smell of decay, and stains resembling blood were visible on the upholstery. It was precisely because of the remains of biological material under the influence of heat that this characteristic stench appeared there. Samples of the suspicious traces were immediately sent for examination to the laboratory. To investigate the car, the forensic experts used luminol and ultraviolet lamps. And as soon as they turned on their equipment, the entire trunk seemed to light up with a bright blue glow. In addition, the attention of law enforcement officers was drawn to the damage to the Audi's bumper. It had been torn off and thrown inside the car. It appeared that the young man simply had not had time to repair this detail after some accident. The police officers were convinced that the car crash was directly related to the blood traces found in the trunk. Despite all these findings, Jason continued to insist that he had no idea where his beloved could be. According to the suspect, during an out-of-town trip, he got stuck in the mud, and when he tried to get out, he tore off the bumper. However, the main person of interest in the case could not comment on the presence of drugs in the home and the large amount of blood in the car. Considering the discovered traces, the police instantly reclassified the disappearance case into a murder investigation. Gary had to be informed of the terrible news. Most likely, he would never see his daughter alive again. Judging by the amount of blood found in the suspect's car trunk, the girl was dead. Jason Lowe was taken into custody on charges of possession of illegal substances. The arrest was intended to prevent the young man from escaping while the investigators did not have more substantial evidence of his involvement in Jessie's murder. Of course, to prove Jason's guilt, the main piece of physical evidence was urgently needed: the victim's body. The detectives brought the suspect to the interrogation room and showed him a photo of the girl whom, in his own words, he loved more than anything in the world. However, Jason's reaction was radically different from the feelings he had described before his arrest. The young man looked irritated and indifferent, coldly looking at the image of the missing girl. At the same time, he still insisted that he had no idea about her whereabouts. Countless questions could not break the resistance of the main suspect. However, the Texas State Prosecutor's Office had the opportunity to charge him with intentional murder, even in the absence of a body. Nevertheless, this circumstance significantly complicated the work of forensic experts. They had to prove that the blood traces found in the trunk were sufficient to consider the girl dead. Additional irrefutable evidence of Jason's guilt was needed for this. Finding the victim's body without the killer's confession seemed an almost impossible task. Obviously, the perpetrator could have damaged the car while transporting Jessie's remains to a deserted area. But Texas is a rather large state with numerous rivers, lakes, vast forests, and fields. So the detectives were seriously afraid that the body of the deceased would most likely never be found. Meanwhile, the girl's relatives organized a memorial evening in her honor. All her loved ones gathered on the beach to say goodbye to Jessie, having lost any hope of ever seeing her alive. They begged God for only one thing: that she would finally be found, and the perpetrator of the tragedy would end up behind bars. On May 19, almost 3 weeks after Jessie was last seen alive, an unexpected breakthrough occurred in the investigation. Thanks to informants' testimonies, the police had strong reasons to believe that the girls' remains were hidden on a remote ranch in the north of the state. The victims' relatives were never told who exactly provided this information, but law enforcement officers assured that the source was reliable. In the evening, a police squad arrived at the specified ranch located in a farming town. The cops immediately began combing the surrounding fields, primarily looking for traces of a car that could have gotten stuck there. Soon, they managed to come across a deep rut from wheels, which led to a pile of garbage mixed with mud. It seemed that this place served someone as an improvised tombstone. Approaching closer, the police officers caught an unbearable stench of decay, so they decided to dig up the suspicious mound. A gruesome sight opened up before them. Inside the pit lay a woman's body, carelessly wrapped in a blue sheet. Obviously, someone had tried to hide the grave under the garbage, but instead only drew extra attention to it. The hastily dug pit at the edge of the field indicated that the perpetrator had acted in a hurry, trying to get away as quickly as possible. It was undoubtedly an amateur's work. The killer had thrown out the body along with blood-stained towels and a blanket, physical evidence that unequivocally pointed to a massacre. The condition of the remains was extremely deplorable. Having spent a week in a stinking pile of junk under the scorching sun, they had undergone significant putrefactive changes. The forensic expert needed a week of painstaking work to officially confirm the identity of the deceased. This was possible only thanks to dental records. It was her, the missing Jessie Bardwell, who was found in that hastily dug grave, which fully confirmed the suspicions of the investigation. Forensic experts officially classified the girl's death as violent, but it was impossible to establish its immediate cause due to the too strong post-mortem changes in the body. About 1,000 people attended the farewell ceremony for the beautiful young Jessie. Of course, not all of them belonged to the circle of her relatives or friends, but this high-profile case stirred the public. Numerous townspeople, sincerely sympathizing with the grief that befell the loving father, came to personally express their support to him. The next 12 months of Gary's life were spent in mourning for his lost daughter. Meanwhile, the main suspect in her murder was behind bars awaiting trial. Jason Lowe was placed in custody in McKinney County, Texas, officially charged with intentional murder. Jason had enough money to hire a lawyer with vast experience, over 42 years of successful practice in criminal cases. The defender immediately took the course of complete acquittal of his client, insisting that in the absence of a criminal record, the young man could not a priori be found guilty of such a serious crime. Although from the very beginning it was obvious that Jason was far from a model of virtue, his human rights activist stubbornly tried to portray his ward as a completely decent member of society. In parallel with this, the victim's father was experiencing the bitterness of loss in his own way. The man sought just punishment for the killer, but events were developing too slowly for his liking. In one moment of anger, Gary even printed out a photo of Jason, put it on a stump near the house, and hit it several times with all his might with a sledgehammer. He admitted that he would readily repeat the same with the real criminal if he managed to escape imprisonment. And although grief fatally wounded the man, Gary did not give up. He wanted only one thing, that the scoundrel who had taken the life of his only daughter would stand trial and pay for what he had done in full. In August 2017, detectives visited Jason Lowe at his place of detention. The investigators aimed to record a video conversation with the accused, but he refused to communicate. The young man stated that he was going to keep his version of events until the moment he appeared before the jury. He fervently believed that the prepared story would be the key to his complete acquittal. Thus, the representatives of the state prosecution never received any information about what line of defense they would have to confront in court. In such circumstances, it was imperative to use any opportunity to hone the tactics of conducting the process, because the prosecutor's office did not even have accurate data on the immediate cause of the girl's death. The huge gaps in the evidence base gave the defendant a real chance to get off scot-free. To properly prepare the prosecution for future battles, a mock trial was organized. This revealed numerous weaknesses in the prosecutor's position. The simulated sessions carefully considered various defense scenarios that the defendant might choose, and approaches to effectively counter them. According to the conviction of the state prosecutors, Jessie did not suspect the dark side of her chosen one's nature until the very end. On the other hand, her father Gary had no doubt that nothing good awaited his daughter in such a relationship. The man described in detail everything that had happened between the lovers over several months. This picture fully corresponded to the behavior of a stubborn manipulator who seeks to tightly control his partner. Although Gary had no direct evidence that Jason had ever raised his hand against Jessie, the sharp deterioration in their communication could not but alert the father. To strengthen its position in court, the prosecution involved two new witnesses, the girl's friends, whom she had met after moving to Texas. The young married couple who rented housing next door seemed quiet and a little shy at first glance. However, these people were the last to see Jessie alive and communicate with her face-to-face without the presence of her boyfriend immediately before the disappearance. According to the witnesses, they sincerely believed the young couple, considering their feelings mutual and deep. The neighbors were just about to leave town for a few days and went on a planned trip on May 1st. Before leaving, they turned to Jessie with a request to look after their dog until they returned. Having come back home, the young couple did not notice anything suspicious. True, they never saw Jessie herself. Jason returned the keys and the dog to the neighbors, explaining the girl's absence by the fact that she had gone somewhere on her own business. He did not say a word about her disappearance or any problems between them, behaving as if nothing had happened. However, the couple found it oddly strange that Jessie no longer appeared in public. And just a few days later, rumors reached them about the threat of Jason's arrest on suspicion of murdering his missing beloved. At that time, the neighbors were still convinced of the young man's innocence. Law enforcement officers suggested that the witnesses visit their friend in prison and try to get him to talk. The cops advised them to discreetly record the conversation, hoping that communication with acquaintances would help obtain important information for the investigation from the suspect. The detectives did not even suspect that this plan would not only work but also allow them to obtain one of the most significant pieces of evidence of Jason's guilt. During a frank conversation, the guy confessed to his friend that he was indeed next to Jessie at the time of her death but called everything that happened a terrible accident. Such wording was automatically regarded as an admission of guilt, albeit of a lesser severity than cold-blooded murder with intent. However, even this was already an indisputable confirmation of Jason's previous lies. One way or another, the investigation had a powerful piece of evidence that was impossible to avoid. The defendant's defenders immediately tried to prohibit the use of this testimony in court, challenging its admissibility. However, the lawyers failed to achieve this. And so, the long-awaited day of the start of the trial finally came. By that time, Gary had already moved to Texas, where he intended to personally fight for the just punishment of the scoundrel who had ruthlessly cut short the life of his beloved daughter. The prosecutor's office was convinced that Jason was a troubled young man with a long history of substance abuse. And although he formally had no criminal record, people from his entourage did not always speak favorably of him. The defendant had practically no close friends, and many acquaintances openly shunned his company. Jason could not control himself and fell into an unrestrained rage under the influence of drugs. According to the investigation, it was in one of the attacks of uncontrolled fury under the influence of drugs that Jason attacked Jessie with fatal consequences. After all, the young man had a pronounced tendency to manipulative actions and sought to control literally every step of his girlfriend. It is likely that Jessie finally realized her fatal mistake and wanted to break off this painful relationship in order to return under the protection of her father. Unfortunately, the attempt to break free from the toxic bonds cost her her life. As evidence of this version, the police found two of Jason's ex-girlfriends. Both confirmed long-standing fears about him. Due to his manipulative inclinations, the man tried every time to tear the girls away from their families. He took his chosen ones to the most remote places and strictly forbade any communication with loved ones there. In relationships, Jason was distinguished by pathological jealousy, which made him lose his temper over any little thing. The situation was especially aggravated by the complete lack of trust on his part. The young man could put forward completely unfounded accusations of infidelity and then pounce with his fists, as if trying to punish his partner in such a perverted way. Both ex-girlfriends did not hide that they had repeatedly become victims of brutal domestic violence, because of which they eventually dared to escape from their tormentor. Fortunately, they managed to break off the relationship precisely because of the beatings, avoiding a much more tragic fate that befell Jessie. Every time the chosen one dared to leave him, Jason fell into an unrestrained rage. And only by a miracle did the two previous girls manage to get out alive. According to the version of the state prosecution, Jason killed Jessie between May 1st and 3rd, most likely on the same day when the neighbors last saw the girl alive. After the massacre, the body lay in the trunk of the car for several more days, until the criminal decided to get rid of the horrifying burden by throwing the bloodied remains at a deserted ranch. Evidence of Jason's involvement in the murder was provided by other biological traces in the car's interior, as well as towels and a blanket found along with the deceased. The most eloquent confirmation of the defendant's guilt was the same blue sheet in which Jessie's mutilated body was wrapped. It was part of a set of bedding, the rest of which was later found in Jason's home. The killer's cynicism knew no bounds, because he continued to sleep on these things even after the deed, as if nothing had happened. On the other hand, the defendant's lawyers resorted to any means to whitewash his image and convince the jury of their client's complete innocence. During his speech in the courtroom, Jason admitted that at the age of 13, he had become addicted to illegal substances, although this happened completely against his will. Allegedly, friends forced the teenager to try drugs, putting him on the needle. At the same time, the accused emphasized that despite the destructive addiction, he managed to remain a purposeful and ambitious guy. He got a job at an advanced technology company, had a decent income, and tried to acquire new knowledge in order to achieve a better life. In front of the jury, the man openly stated his sincere intentions to create a strong family with Jessie and buy a joint home for them. And he explained the tragedy that occurred as a banal coincidence. Only during the court session did Jason finally present his own version of events, which stunned everyone present. According to him, on that fatal evening, the lovers took pills together designed to enhance libido and the brightness of sexual sensations. After that, the young couple decided to make love right in the shower. It was during these passionate caresses that the girl slipped and hit her head hard on the side of the bathtub. Jessie barely managed to sit up, firmly clutching her head with her hands. She kept repeating that she felt unwell. The guy helped her get out of the dangerous place and was going to call an ambulance, but the girl stopped him. Allegedly, she just needed to get a good night's sleep, and everything would pass. The lovers did just that, they went to bed, but in the morning, Jason found his beloved lifeless. By personal admission, this loss literally broke his heart. The young man fell into a state of shock and despair. He desperately tried to bring the girl to her senses, even slapping her in the vain hope of a miracle. But Jessie was already dead. Jason was terribly afraid to call the police, as he had no doubt that he would immediately be accused of intentional murder. Therefore, he decided to simply get rid of the body, but he had no idea how to do it correctly. By a coincidence favorable for the accused, on the same day, a supplier of illegal drugs visited him. Jason told him about the terrible incident that had occurred, and the dealer agreed to help hide the traces of the crime. Together they packed Jessie's lifeless body in a blue sheet, after which they hid the horrifying cargo in the trunk of the guy's Audi. Only later did Jason take out and bury the remains of his beloved at a deserted ranch. However, the investigation failed to find any evidence of the participation of a third party in this burial. The defendant's confession dealt a tangible blow to the position of the state prosecution. However, the subsequent facts from Jason's life did not at all indicate the mental suffering of a person who had lost the most precious person in the world. While Jessie's body was slowly decomposing in the trunk of the car, her killer was already actively making new acquaintances, vividly communicating with other girls, making dates with them, and even turning flirting into intimate relationships. While examining the suspect's mobile phone, investigators came across substantial confirmations of his dubious grief. It turned out that shortly after the disappearance of one girl, Jason managed to communicate dissolutely and exchange candid photos with several new passions at once. As the prosecution insisted, with loud slaps, the inhuman man tried to mask the traces of a brutal beating that led to a fatal craniocerebral injury. It was the one that was later stated by forensic experts during the autopsy of Jessie's mutilated body. After all, even from the suspect's own words, one thing was obvious: such blows could not at all serve as a way to bring the girl back to consciousness after an accident. The prosecutor irrefutably proved that the injuries were the result of intentional beatings, so Jason's entire story from beginning to end was a complete fabrication. After interrogating the accused, another stunning piece of information came to light. It turned out that the mysterious informant who led the investigation to the place where the victim's body was hidden was none other than the killer himself. The defense immediately tried to turn this fact in favor of their client, trying to mitigate Jason's guilt before the law. However, in reality, his actions had nothing to do with sincere repentance or sympathy for the relatives of the deceased. The killer pursued a clear goal: to avoid the most severe punishment that threatened him at any cost. It was for this reason that the young man eventually agreed to a deal with the prosecution. In exchange for admitting his guilt, he expected to receive only half of the maximum possible term of imprisonment, that is, 50 years instead of 99. In the end, the sentence for Jason Lowe fully corresponded to the agreements reached: 50 years behind bars. The defendant will receive the right to parole no earlier than 2051. After the verdict was delivered, the convict was repeatedly visited by media representatives who hoped to shed light on the white spots in this high-profile case. However, Jason never resorted to frankness, not revealing any new details. He still stubbornly insisted that Jessie's death was a tragic accident that had nothing to do with his criminal actions. This story took place in Sweden and drew attention to long-standing problems. Saga Elneborg, the main character, was only 20 years old and 7 months pregnant. She had been dating her boyfriend, Mohammed Ibrahim, whom she called Amin, for about 2 years. He was the father of her unborn child. The couple was eagerly awaiting the birth of a boy who, according to doctors, was perfectly healthy. Saga carefully prepared for motherhood. She set up a nursery, bought necessary items, and did special exercises. The pregnancy brought her true joy. Throughout this time, she kept a kind of online diary, posting photos of her growing belly and purchases for the baby. She especially enjoyed sharing pictures of tiny clothes. Saga's mother, Melissa, regularly visited her daughter to help out. On Sunday, April 28, Saga planned to spend time alone with her beloved. However, lately, more and more disagreements had been arising in their relationship, so Amin visited his pregnant girlfriend less often. That day, Saga told her mother that he was going to stop by, so Melissa decided not to interfere with their conversation. Saga was a charming, vibrant personality, a kind and well-mannered girl. At school, she had many friends and easily got along with people. The heroine dreamed of starting a family and having children, and thanks to her attractiveness, she had many admirers. Therefore, Melissa was surprised to see Amin on the doorstep of her home. Saga's family was wary of her relationship with a boy from a different culture. They understood that difficulties might arise when it came to meeting his family, especially after their daughter began to describe the problems in their relationship in detail. Despite this, Saga was full of enthusiasm and optimism. She loved Amin and wanted to preserve their relationship. However, it bothered her that he constantly hid her from his parents, which often led to arguments between the couple. Around 1 p.m. on April 29, 2023, Melissa Elneborg arrived at Saga's apartment in a residential complex in the city of Örebro, about 100 kilometers from Stockholm. She was going to help her daughter and pick up some things that had accumulated in anticipation of her grandson. When the woman arrived at the building, she was talking on the phone with her other daughter. Melissa rang the doorbell, but no one answered. She tried a few more times, but to no avail. It seemed strange to her. Melissa knocked, then used the intercom, called and texted Saga, but still received no response. The woman assumed that her daughter had simply forgotten about her arrival and went out on an errand. However, Melissa had a spare key and could enter the apartment without Saga's knowledge. She simply did not want to disturb the young couple. When she approached the door to unlock it, it turned out that the lock was already open. This seemed extremely suspicious to her. Saga was always very careful and locked the doors, even if she was going out for just a minute to pick up mail or go down to the laundry room. She would never leave the apartment unlocked. Once inside, Melissa heard running water in the kitchen. She ran there and turned off the faucet, calling for her daughter, but there was no answer. In the next room, the woman noticed something unusual. When she turned on the light, Melissa screamed in horror. She saw Saga lying on the floor lifeless. The girl was pale, her face covered by disheveled hair. A cord from a table lamp lay nearby, but the most terrifying thing was that a heavy table had pinned Saga's throat with its edge. Melissa rushed to her daughter, pushed the table aside, and removed the cord from her neck. Then she called an ambulance and began performing CPR on Saga. The woman immediately noticed that her daughter's body was already cold and her skin was icy. It seemed that Saga had been dead for quite some time. Paramedics arrived quickly but, as expected, could only pronounce the young woman and her unborn child dead. The police who arrived at the scene examined the apartment and the body. Saga had injuries to her head and face, covered in dried blood and matted hair. There were no obvious signs of a struggle in the home, but some furniture was scattered, jewelry boxes overturned, and their contents strewn across the floor. However, no traces of a break-in were found, so the detectives initially even considered the possibility of suicide. But thanks to Melissa's testimony and a check of the data from the victim's cell phone, it was established that Saga could not have taken her own life. She had no mental disorders or problems. On the contrary, the girl was full of life and happiness, especially since becoming pregnant. She was eagerly awaiting the birth of her child and would never have killed herself and the baby. Forensic experts collected several fingerprint samples, blood, DNA from under the victim's nails, and furniture at the crime scene for further analysis. The coroner determined that the cause of Saga's death was strangulation, and the time of death fell between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. Not only the body of the 20-year-old mother was brought in for autopsy, but also a boy weighing 1.7 kilograms. The autopsy and analyses showed that the baby was completely healthy. These findings only fueled Melissa's anger, who demanded just retribution for the murderer. The tragedy came as a real shock to Saga's mother, the entire family, and friends. No one could believe that such a brutal criminal, capable of such a bloody massacre, had been close to the girl. Saga was too far removed from the criminal world for her life to end so tragically. The detectives immediately started the investigation by talking to the victim's relatives. Of course, the first person they questioned was Melissa, the heroine's mother. The woman said that on April 28, Saga was going to meet with several friends at a restaurant. Melissa herself joined their company. She noticed that her daughter was nervous and constantly checking her phone. Saga seemed agitated and admitted that she was waiting for a message from her boyfriend. Saga shared that her beloved had finally decided to tell his parents about their relationship. At the same time, he was very worried that they would not accept the fact that the girl was already 7 months pregnant and the couple had not officially married. The story's heroine confided that Amin was extremely concerned about this issue and was even on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He was almost certain that his parents would condemn their relationship. After all, they were Somalis, professed Islam, and held extremely conservative views. Saga, on the other hand, was a Swedish citizen, half Thai, half European by origin, and adhered to modern values. Her boyfriend, along with his family, had come to the country as refugees when Amin was still very young. In fact, the boy grew up in Europe, had more progressive thinking than his family, but still respected their traditions. It was also a major problem that Amin's relatives were Muslims, while Saga came from a Christian family. Due to such differences in worldviews and customs, conflicts often flared up between the lovers, and their relationship was quite tense. After dinner at the restaurant, Saga said goodbye to her mother and friends. They wished her luck, not even suspecting that they were seeing the girl alive for the last time. It later turned out that, after returning home, Saga was murdered. Investigators suggested that Amin might have had time to share information about his relationship with the girl with his family. This likely caused an outburst of aggression in them, which led to the tragedy. Therefore, in the early stages of the investigation, the possible involvement of Amin's relatives in the crime was considered. Suspicion fell on the behavior of the boy's mother, who left the house late in the evening. But later it was established that the woman had simply gone to the store and returned about 15 minutes later. No evidence was found that Amin's relatives were in any way involved in the murder. The boy's mother also aroused suspicion due to her hostile attitude towards her son. Once she found out that the car Amin was using was parked near Saga's house. At that point, the family already suspected that the young man was dating a Christian woman. After the car incident, the furious mother wrote to Amin that he was no longer a welcome guest in her home. The woman believed that if her son neglected traditions, it was easier to disown him. In response, the boy insisted that he had not even entered Saga's house, and eventually managed to convince his own mother of this, although it was not easy for him. Melissa recounted that from the very beginning of the pregnancy, the couple's relationship deteriorated. Rumor had it that Amin insisted on an abortion, fearing a negative reaction from his relatives. Despite this, the girl decided to keep the baby. Saga stated that if necessary, she could raise the child on her own. Back in the fall, in October, she shared the news of her pregnancy with her family. Everyone was happy about it, including Saga herself. However, at that time the lovers were on the verge of breaking up. The girl often complained that her boyfriend's culture was so different from what was customary in Sweden that it would be difficult for them to find common ground if Amin did not change his views. However, a few months later, the situation seemed to have improved. The young man adapted to Saga's lifestyle and accepted her pregnancy. He even showed joy about the upcoming fatherhood. Shortly after that, the girl moved to a new apartment. She decided to rent a more spacious place with a separate room for the baby and started furnishing it. By March 2023, the couple was still together, but troubling signs began to appear. Once a woman named Diana approached Saga and secretly told her that Amin had tried to persuade her to attack the pregnant girl. He insisted that it was necessary to hit Saga in the stomach several times to provoke a miscarriage. Upon hearing this, the heroine made a scene with her boyfriend, but he denied everything, calling Diana's words a lie. Melissa learned about these horrible things but did not want to believe them. However, now that she had found her daughter dead, this information started to make sense. The investigation set out to reconstruct the chronology of events on the eve of the tragedy. It was quickly established that on April 27, Amin and Saga planned to spend the evening together. However, it seemed that the boy was deliberately avoiding meeting his beloved, staying late at work. That evening, Saga gave him an ultimatum. She insisted that Amin must tell his family about their relationship, confess that he was innocent, and also inform them about the girl's relocation and pregnancy. Otherwise, they would break up. On April 28, the young people were at work, but they actively corresponded in messengers all day. Saga was eagerly awaiting news from Amin. Melissa noted that during that period, her daughter was very restless and extremely nervous. Obviously, this was due to the heated communication with her boyfriend. Detectives thoroughly examined the victim's cell phone. It was confirmed that intense correspondence between the lovers continued until 11 p.m. on April 28. At 11:15 p.m., Amin stated that he was not going to tell his parents about Saga and their romance. He claimed that his family was more important to him than an out-of-wedlock child. This decision clearly saddened and disappointed the girl, but she continued to persuade the boy to take this step. Saga argued that when they parted ways, his relatives would find out anyway, as she intended to demand financial support from him for raising the baby. Ultimately, during that correspondence, the young couple agreed that Amin would confess about Saga and their unborn child to his family. The boy replied that he was so worried that his heart was about to jump out of his chest. It was his last message to his beloved. Some time after that, the girl was killed. According to investigators, Saga's persistence and the risk that she might talk to Amin's parents herself gave him a serious motive for the attack. In fact, the young man was the only suspect in this case. He was brought in for questioning. The 22-year-old man denied his involvement in the crime. According to him, on the evening when the murder took place, he went to his family to tell them about his relationship with Saga. But geolocation data indicated that this was not true. In reality, Amin had headed to his girlfriend's apartment. Interestingly, at first, they did not even tell him what had happened to Saga. During the interrogation, the boy behaved strangely. He was too calm, even joked with the police officers. When they told him the address of the apartment where Saga's body was found, Amin did not even change his expression. It seemed as if he was pretending not to know the address. When investigators told Amin that he was the main suspect in the murder, he switched to a defensive position. The boy claimed that he was not responsible for what had happened and had an alibi. According to him, at the time of Saga's murder, he was driving with a friend. However, the mentioned friend was allegedly talking on the phone with someone else and refused to testify in Amin's favor. Despite the failure of the alibi, the suspect continued to insist that he last saw the girl on the evening of April 27. However, this contradicted his earlier statements that he had never been to the apartment whose address he allegedly did not know. The suspect began to claim that he had visited Saga's apartment, where they discussed painful issues. In particular, it was about the need to open up to his parents. Saga, on the other hand, insisted that Amin move in with her so that the young couple could finally start a real family. However, as detectives found out, the boy never stayed overnight in his beloved's new home. He feared that his relatives would find out about his relationship. Amin repeatedly promised to arrange the move, but every time he needed to confirm his words with actions, he refused under various pretexts. Due to the young man's suspicious behavior, law enforcement officers decided to detain him and take him into custody until all the circumstances were clarified. Amin spent several months behind bars. Eventually, prosecutors were able to provide strong evidence of his guilt. The accusers were convinced that the available material was more than enough for success in court hearings. During the investigation, even specially trained dogs were used. With their help, it was confirmed that several pieces of evidence and traces belonged to the suspect. Amin's lawyer claimed that a dog could not be considered a reliable source of information and used as the main argument. But these were far from the only proofs of the boy's guilt. The DNA analysis results took the longest to wait for. When the examination removed all doubts, it became clear that the killer was Mohammedan. Investigators were able to convincingly prove that it was he who strangled his girlfriend with an electrical cord, wrapping it around her neck while Saga was half asleep. But, as the operatives believed, this was not enough for the criminal. He dragged the unconscious Saga to the floor and pulled a 30-kilogram table up to her. It seems that the murderer tried to knock it over on the victim's stomach to interrupt the pregnancy in this way. The girl resisted the attacker with all her might, so she was able to protect her unborn child with her own body, receiving a bruised thigh in the process. Then the killer decided to finish the massacre by pressing the tabletop against Saga's throat. The exhausted girl desperately fought for her life, suffocating under the weight of the massive object, but she could not throw it off. When Saga finally died, the tabletop remained on her neck, pinning her body to the floor. Later, a deep post-mortem imprint formed on her skin. After the brutal crime, Amin made a mess in the apartment, scattering things from several drawers. The defendant's lawyer even insisted that the girl had died at the hands of robbers who had stolen money and some household appliances. However, prosecutors considered the staging of the robbery an aggravating circumstance. After all, many of the missing items were later found in Amin's possession during searches. The boy, in turn, claimed that those were his personal belongings, as well as gifts from the girl. An important fact was also that under the victim's nails, experts found traces of Mohammedan's DNA. In addition, the coroner established that shortly before her death, Saga had sexual contact with her partner. Amin claimed that the intimacy occurred by mutual consent when the girl was still alive, literally a few days before the tragedy. Of course, the prosecution doubted the truthfulness of these statements. The accusers also drew the jury's attention to the numerous inconsistencies and outright lies that abounded in the suspect's testimony. Numerous biological traces of Amin were found in Saga's apartment, although at first, he claimed that he did not know the address at all and had never been there. Investigators managed to prove that a woman named Diana, who complained about the boy's threats, was telling the truth. Several alarming queries were found in his search history on his gadgets. In particular, the young man was interested in whether a kick to a pregnant woman's stomach could lead to the death of an unborn child. During the court hearings, prosecutors demonstrated numerous screenshots of correspondence between Saga and Amin, dating back to December 2022. It was then that the lovers' relationship began to deteriorate due to the girl's pregnancy. From the last messages that the young couple exchanged on April 28, it followed that Saga was trying in every way to encourage her beloved and urge him to confess to his parents about their romance. The girl was clearly pressuring Amin, which his lawyers repeatedly mentioned. However, this in no way justified the committed crime. The prosecutors were convinced that instead of going to his relatives, the suspect had visited his passion's apartment. He never intended to tell his family about Saga, he was too afraid of their reaction. But the girl backed him into a corner with her demands. So Amin brutally and cold-bloodedly dealt with her out of sheer fear of his parents. The killer's defender suggested that the DNA samples under the victim's nails could have been left there long ago, since the lovers had been together for some time. However, Melissa insisted that her daughter often took showers, especially during pregnancy. The mother even thought that Saga treated cleanliness too pedantically. So the girl definitely could not have remained unwashed for more than a day after her last meeting with Amin. It was obvious that before her death, she had managed to wash and change into fresh clothes. Accordingly, all the biological traces found on her body ended up there directly during the attack. Strangely, immediately after Saga's death, her boyfriend deleted the girl from all his social networks and messengers, and also erased their correspondence for the last few days. It became clear to the detectives that in this way, he was trying to hide his involvement in the crime. However, the lost data was restored without effort, replenishing the already considerable amount of evidence against the suspect. Although there was a lack of direct evidence of Amin's guilt, his behavior clearly indicated that Saga's fate was indifferent to him. Investigators managed to find out that around 8 p.m. on the day of the tragedy, Mohammedan was near his girlfriend's apartment building. The boy was sitting in the car at a distance and continued to correspond, not driving closer or leaving. As if he was waiting for something. Perhaps at this time, he was trying to muster up the courage to attack, or he wanted to make sure that Saga was sound asleep. Then there was a sharp lull. As it turned out, from midnight to 2 in the morning, Amin's mobile phone was not used. That night, the suspect's friend, Samir, could not get through to his comrade. The young man ignored the call because his phone was in airplane mode. The signal from the mobile was recorded in the same residential complex where Saga had recently moved. This detail revealed another discrepancy in Mohammedan's testimony. After all, according to him, all that time he was supposedly at home with his parents. The killer's phone came to life only at 2:06 a.m. Interestingly, this very time is indicated in the coroner's report as the probable moment of death of the young mother and her unborn child. During the investigation, the defendant's versions changed several times. At some point, he began to claim that a whole gang of robbers was operating in Saga's home. As Amin confessed, he left a bag with a large sum of money in the girl's house. However, he never explained where he got these funds from. The man claimed that the attackers broke into the apartment for the purse with cash. Allegedly, Saga tried to prevent the thieves and paid with her life for it. However, the prosecution easily refuted these statements. After all, no signs of forcible entry were found at the crime scene. It was obvious that the victim herself opened the door to the killer. Or he had his own key to the apartment, which also fully corresponded to Mohammedan's capabilities. During the 9 months spent in pre-trial detention, the accused never admitted his guilt. He categorically denied any involvement in the tragedy. But during this time, prosecutors managed to gather a solid evidence base, supported by both direct and indirect facts. Despite Amin's stubbornness, he still did not renounce his words that he was afraid to tell his relatives about his relationship with Saga. He claimed that he sincerely loved the girl and even the child she was expecting. But the young man was convinced that his family would certainly disown him because of the shame. And indeed, these fears were fueled by stark differences in religion, outlook on life, and cultural traditions between the young couple. Later, the defendant even admitted that his parents' worldview was so orthodox that, in their opinion, he had no right to date a girl of European origin. After listening to the arguments of the prosecution and defense, the jury went to the deliberation room on June 9, 2024. The panel's verdict was unanimous. Mohammedan Ibrahim was guilty of the premeditated murder of Saga Elneborg. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. However, even after the announcement of the verdict, the young man continued to claim that he loved his chosen one and their unborn son. Allegedly, he never even thought of harming his loved ones. Amin insisted that violence was not at all in his nature, and the incriminated crime was the first and only criminal episode in his life. At the same time, the investigation managed to establish that during the 2 years of the relationship with the victim, the killer repeatedly cheated on her with other women. Despite his assurances of chastity, it turned out that Amin regularly made new acquaintances with persons of the opposite sex and often entered into intimate relationships with them. These revelations added dark colors to the image of the defendant, which his lawyer diligently tried to whitewash. The defender stood to the end on the fact that his client was innocent. They claimed that Saga died at the hands of a random robber. The defense counsel stated his intention to fight for Amin's freedom and readiness to appeal the verdict in the appellate court. The complaint was filed immediately after the announcement of the court's decision, but time will tell what result it will affect. Despite the guilty verdict for the murder of Saga Elneborg, the death of her unborn child during the attack was not separately qualified. This greatly outraged the relatives of the deceased, because in fact, the death of the baby was simply ignored. The tragedy that befell the young and talented always evokes profound sadness and heartache. It seems as if life itself has been unfairly cut short at the very beginning, not allowing the full potential to be realized and dreams to be achieved. This story is not about two lovers whose feelings were stronger than death. It is a tale of those who left too soon, leaving behind only memories and unfulfilled dreams. Jamie and Peter James could never have imagined that they would have to endure the most terrible grief that can befall parents, the loss of a beloved daughter. The morning of October 26, 2023 brought shocking news. At 4:30 a.m., the principal of the prestigious St. Andrew's Cathedral School, located in the heart of Sydney, sent urgent emails to all students and their parents. The message stated that the school would be closed until the end of the week due to an emergency. Just 2 hours passed, and the worried families received another message from the school administration. The leadership assured that no student was harmed, but the news itself was extremely alarming. Particularly disconcerting was the clarification that this order did not apply to graduates who had to take exams. For those who needed psychological support during this difficult time, a 24-hour counseling center was set up in the school library. Over the next 2 days, on Thursday and Friday, the school grounds and all its buildings underwent a thorough examination by forensic experts. Attention was drawn to the gym, access to which was restricted. The adjacent shower area was subject to dismantling. What really happened within the walls of this educational institution? As it became known, around midnight on October 25, 2023, the body of a woman was found at the school. She was last seen alive at 7 in the evening, when she, being a water polo coach, entered the gym showers and never came out. Security cameras recorded that around 8 p.m., an unknown person followed her. Subsequently, this person left the school premises alone, heading for the exit. The woman's disappearance was first reported by her parents. Lilie, as the deceased was called, had not been in contact all day. At 10 o'clock in the evening, she sent a message asking to be picked up from work, but no longer answered calls. Fortunately, the police, who had already been informed about the situation, took control of the case. The grim discovery was made by the night watchman during his rounds. On the shower floor, he saw a woman lying in a pool of blood with a shattered head. After recovering from the initial shock, the man immediately called the emergency services. Later, detectives invited a close friend of the James family to identify the body. The face of the deceased was so disfigured that it was difficult to identify her. When the news of the tragedy became public, Lilie's house was filled with people. Friends, neighbors, acquaintances, everyone came to express their condolences and support the girl's relatives during this mournful time. Local residents shared the family's grief and showed their deep respect for the prematurely deceased, turning the space around the house into a true memorial of flowers and toys. But this mysterious death was not the only shock. Another tragedy occurred on the morning of October 27, just 11 miles from the site of the first crime. There, the remains of a male body were found. It was discovered by vendors working nearby on the cliffs of Diamond Bay Reserve, located in the eastern suburbs of Sydney. Upon receiving the call, the police quickly formed a rescue team. Divers, Marines, and a search and rescue helicopter joined the operation. At 3:30 p.m., the man's body was lifted to the surface and handed over to forensic experts for identification. Due to numerous injuries sustained from falling from a great height, visual identification was impossible. Fingerprints had to be used for this purpose. Experts made assumptions about the identity of the deceased, but solid confirmations were needed for final conclusions. Eventually, it was established that it was 24-year-old Paul Tyson, who was suspected of committing a crime against Lilie. Investigators faced a difficult task, to find a connection between the two fatal incidents and to find out what exactly happened between these people a few days before the tragedy. Lilie was born in May 2002 in the picturesque coastal town of Sans Souci, located in the Australian state of New South Wales. She became the first child in the loving and close-knit James family, immediately winning the hearts of all family members. Her maternal grandmother, Barbara, felt a particularly strong attachment to the girl and simply adored her granddaughter. Lilie's childhood passed in an idyllic place, on the ocean coast, where she spent a lot of time with her younger brother Max. The girl grew up surprisingly active and resilient, and her greatest passion was swimming. Lilie's father, who worked as a water polo coach at an Anglican girls' school in Hustville, fully supported his daughter's enthusiasm and encouraged her to play sports. Lilie's friends remembered her as an extremely sociable and benevolent personality. She not only achieved significant success in her studies, but was always ready to help those classmates who faced certain difficulties. These wonderful human qualities made Lilie a true favorite in her circle of friends, so she was never left alone. In high school, Lilie began to prove herself as a real star. Thanks to her outstanding achievements in studies, sports, and active participation in the school's social life, she was recognized as one of the best students. It seemed that whatever she undertook, success was guaranteed. Lilie's incredible talent lay in her ability to equally brilliantly prove herself in all areas of activity, which aroused genuine admiration from those around her. In addition to sports, Lilie showed an extraordinary interest in dramatic art. This passion led her to participate in the school's theater and dance club. Over time, the talented girl became known outside the school and received an invitation to participate in the prestigious Woodford Folk Festival. This annual event is one of the largest in Australia and attracts about 125,000 visitors, including both local residents and guests from other regions of the country and from abroad. The festival usually takes place from December 27th to January 1st and is an integral part of the New Year celebration. Its program is marked by an extraordinary variety of genres and styles, including circus acts, cabaret, comedy performances, street performances, master classes, debates, etc. Lilie decided to present at the festival a unique interpretation of a monologue from Shakespeare's Macbeth. During the performance, Lilie was able to fully demonstrate her acting skills, natural charm and appeal. Her performance was met with thunderous applause and the highest approval from the jury. As a result, the girl took an honorable second place in the theater category, which became a real triumph and a significant achievement in her creative biography. In addition to the recognition, Lilie also received a solid cash prize. 2018 brought another victory for young Miss James. She successfully passed the exam and obtained a driver's license for beginners. Lilie's athletic achievements are also worth a special mention. Following the example of her father, the girl began to professionally engage in water polo. Persistent training and natural talent allowed her to win the honorary title of swimming champion in the under-17 age category. Lilie's parents were incredibly proud of their daughter and rejoiced at each of her successes. By the senior year, Lilie had clearly defined her future and decided to focus on her sports career. That is why in 2020 she entered the University of Technology Sydney with the aim of obtaining a bachelor's degree in sports business management. A real turning point in Lilie's life was the fateful meeting that took place in 2021. Wanting to diversify her student life and gain teaching experience, she got a job as a water polo coach at St. Andrew's Cathedral School. Thanks to her young age, bright personality and sincere love for sports, Lilie quickly found common ground with the school administration, colleagues and students. The students were drawn to her, trying to meet the high standards she set. In turn, Lilie made every effort to find an individual approach to each student and reveal their unique abilities. It was during this period that she met a new cricket and hockey coach named Paul Tyson. His professionalism and attractiveness immediately attracted the attention of those around him. The ambitious young man, in addition to his main job, also taught part-time at another educational institution and was a player on the University of New South Wales hockey team. Without a doubt, Paul was extremely popular, especially among the fairer sex. However, opinions about him were divided. Some considered him proud and stubborn, while others noted his positive character traits. Initially, communication between Lilie and Paul was exclusively friendly and limited to regular greetings. But over time, their relationship began to grow into something more. Lilie's friends said that one day the young man asked her out on a date. The girl found it hard to resist his dazzling smile, and she accepted the invitation. The first date made a great impression on both of them, so they decided to continue communicating. Not suspecting the true nature of her chosen one, Lilie immersed herself in the relationship with her head, captivated by his charm and open to new feelings. It seemed that Paul was also sincerely fascinated by her. He showered the girl with compliments, gave her flowers and arranged romantic evenings. At the same time, the young couple agreed to keep their connection a secret from others, especially from the school students. This was dictated both by the requirements of school policy and Lilie's personal beliefs, as she valued the privacy of her life. Therefore, at work they behaved with maximum caution and restraint. However, despite all their efforts, rumors about their relationship began to spread throughout the school over time. At first it was just cautious whispers, but later they turned into open discussions. Having learned who exactly revealed the secret of their romance, Lilie felt bitter disappointment. It turned out that Paul broke the promise they had made. The situation was further aggravated by the derogatory manner in which he allowed himself to speak about Lilie, which caused condemnation from the young colleague. The girl felt betrayed and humiliated. Not wanting to put up with such an attitude, she firmly told Paul everything she thought about his actions and broke off the relationship. It later became known that the young man tried to regain Lilie's favor and repeatedly apologized, but the girl was adamant. The only consolation for her was the realization that the romance did not last long, and in a relatively short period of time she managed to discern Paul's true essence. Paul was born in 1999 in the Netherlands. His parents, wealthy and influential people in certain circles, made the decision to change their country of residence in 2015, when the head of the family was offered a new position in Australia. This move was fateful for the young man and greatly influenced the formation of his personality. Being the only child in the Tyson family, Paul was surrounded by excessive attention and care from his parents since childhood. Undoubtedly, such an upbringing left its mark on the boy's character. He grew up egocentric and somewhat spoiled, used to the idea of his own exclusivity. Paul knew his worth and was not ashamed to demonstrate it. Despite this, the young man achieved significant success in his studies and sports, and his impressive physique immediately caught the eye. Finding himself in a new place, Paul became a student at the prestigious St. Andrew's Cathedral School. There he joined the school cricket team and quickly established himself as a talented and promising player. His sporting achievements brought him recognition and respect from his peers. Soon Paul was appointed captain of the team, which was a testament to his leadership qualities and authority among his comrades. In addition to his sporting victories, the young man actively participated in organizing various extracurricular activities and festivals. However, it was during this period that people's attitudes towards Paul began to take on an ambiguous character. Some of the boys felt hostility towards the self-assured peer who boasted of his ability to win the heart of any girl. On the other hand, ladies found Paul surprisingly charming and sociable, willingly communicating with him. After completing his schooling in 2017, the administration of the educational institution, properly assessing the organizational abilities and sporting talent of the graduate, offered him the position of assistant coach in cricket and hockey. Paul gladly accepted this offer, and already at the beginning of 2018 he headed the corresponding sections. It is worth noting that the young mentor felt confident in his job and successfully coped with his leadership responsibilities. However, Paul unexpectedly resigned soon after and returned to the Netherlands, where his family lived. The real reasons for such a sudden decision remained unclear. Once at home, the young man did not stand still, but decided to continue his education. He successfully obtained a master's degree in sports management, which later opened up new career prospects for him. During a meeting with old friends, Paul shared that he had significantly improved his coaching skills, and this soon bore fruit. A lucrative offer came from his former employer to return to his previous job. So at the beginning of 2020, the doors of the familiar school opened again for the ambitious specialist. As soon as he set foot on Australian soil, Paul met an old friend who offered to share the rent for housing. Despite the fact that the young man had enough funds to rent an apartment on his own, he agreed to such an idea, believing that living together would be much more comfortable. Their economical choice fell on an apartment located in Kensington, an eastern suburb of Sydney. At first, harmony reigned between the friends. They willingly spent time together, visiting local bars after work. However, after a few months, their relationship began to sour, and the impulsive Paul decided that it would be better for him to live separately. Paul's parents realized that, despite his constant busyness and wide circle of friends, their son felt lonely at heart. They had no information about his romantic ties, although they assumed that Paul was not too concerned about serious relationships. In March 2020, the world was shaken by an unexpected event that affected both the lives of individual countries and the global situation as a whole. The rapid spread of coronavirus infection forced Australia to declare a state of emergency and introduce strict quarantine restrictions that lasted for a year and a half. Paul found himself alone with the challenges of the pandemic, unable to leave the country and visit relatives due to the risk of illness. The large-scale lockdown affected all spheres of life, so the young man had to cope with the difficulties that arose in his path on his own. In the summer of 2021, life gradually began to return to normal, but the consequences of prolonged isolation made themselves felt, significantly affecting interpersonal relationships. When Paul resumed his previous duties, some of those around him noticed striking changes in the behavior and character of the young coach. Paul immersed himself in sports activities and became one of the key players in the hockey team, continuing to lead an active lifestyle. He was even invited to participate in advertising videos of matches. At the same time, colleagues and acquaintances noted some traits that had not previously manifested in his character, in particular uncontrolled outbursts of anger. In addition, rumors spread through the school corridors about the excessive attention Paul paid to his female students. The young mentor was repeatedly spotted openly flirting with the girls, pointedly lingering his gaze on them for a long time, making them blush and feel awkward. Despite everything, Paul remained a significant figure in the sporting life of the educational institution. His performances played an important role in promoting the team to the finals of the Australian Hockey League. However, the breakup with Lilie was a real blow to Paul's ego. When investigators began investigating the case, the involvement of the suspect was beyond doubt. Law enforcement officers managed to quickly track down the perpetrator. The footage from the video surveillance cameras installed both inside the school premises and in the surrounding area played an important role in this. Paul, probably due to his overconfidence, carelessly got into the lens several times. In addition, law enforcement officials made official inquiries to the company that serviced Lilie and Paul's mobile communications. It was important for the investigation to determine the last known location of the suspect, so it was decided to track his movements using GPS data. Also, in the interests of the investigation, it was necessary to find the victim's phone. Investigators hoped that the messages stored in the device's memory could shed light on the circumstances and motives of the crime committed. After some time, information about the location of both devices was obtained. Moreover, by restoring the chronology of events, the investigation managed to find out that a few days before the attack, Paul bought a hammer at a hardware store. Obviously, the young man was filled with anger due to the breakup with Lilie and decided to brutally get even with her, although the girl's guilt in the situation that developed raised great doubts. The events of that fateful day unfolded as follows. In the morning of October 25th, Lilie, as usual, went to the university, and later to work. At about the same time, her former admirer rented a silver Lexus and headed to the school. Since he had no scheduled classes, Paul decided not to enter the building, but lurked in the car, waiting for the right moment. When the students dispersed to their homes and the school emptied, the criminal slipped into the gym. To avoid unnecessary questions, he hid the hammer under his jacket in advance. Once in place, Paul began to watch Lilie's movements, waiting for the victim to be alone. After the training, the girl went to the shower room to refresh herself. It was at this moment, when she was most vulnerable, that the insidious stalker with a hammer in his hand broke into the room. A fierce argument broke out between the former lovers, in the heat of which Paul pounced on the defenseless Lilie and hit her on the head with all his might. As the results of the autopsy later showed, the girl's death was instantaneous. She did not even have time to realize what had happened, and therefore did not suffer from pain. Having spent about an hour by the lifeless body, the killer hastily shoved Lilie's personal belongings into her backpack and hurriedly left the building. He got behind the wheel of the rented car and sped towards Diamond Bay, where he intended to get rid of the murder weapon. There, Paul threw the bloody hammer into the nearest trash can, hoping to forever conceal the traces of his crime. However, at 8:47 p.m., the perpetrator was captured by video surveillance cameras installed nearby. This circumstance later significantly helped the investigation. The last location of Paul that investigators were able to establish was recorded at Gap Point, a picturesque cliff located on the southern coast of Sydney. This scenic spot attracts not only numerous tourists, but unfortunately is also a popular location for suicides. Around 10 o'clock in the evening, a message was sent from Lilie's phone to her father, Mark James. Probably, in this way, Paul tried to draw attention to the place where the girl's lifeless body lay. Perhaps, seized by remorse, he hoped for help or simply wanted to inform relatives about where they could find their daughter. The James' extraordinary concern was evidenced by the countless attempts to call Lilie's number. An hour later, Paul finally dared to call the emergency number, but changed his mind a moment later and hung up. It seems that a fatal decision was brewing in his head, which he finally made the next moment. Without hesitation, the man took a step into the abyss, ending his life and leaving this world forever. When the police arrived at the scene, Paul was no longer among the living. Instead, law enforcement officers found personal belongings that belonged to the former lovers. The rented car was parked nearby, which only confirmed the suspicions about the young man's death. It is quite possible that he simply could not cope with the feeling of guilt that was gnawing at him, or was afraid of the inevitability of punishment for the crime committed. Be that as it may, the urgent task of the investigators was to find the body of the missing person. On the morning of October 26, helicopters and Coast Guard boats joined the search operation. The entire perimeter of the coast was taken under close surveillance, and the territories adjacent to Diamond Bay were thoroughly surrounded. Unfortunately, the first day of searches did not bring any results. Only the next day, the waves of the surf accidentally threw Paul's body onto the rocks of a nearby reserve. After carrying out all the necessary examinations and an autopsy, it became obvious that it was he who was responsible for the murder of Lilie James. However, in view of his own death, it was impossible to bring the perpetrator to criminal responsibility, so the case had to be closed. Subsequently, Paul's remains were handed over to his parents, who decided not to transport them back to the Netherlands, but to cremate the ashes and scatter them in the sky over Sydney. The farewell to Lilie took place on November 17, 2023 within the walls of her native school located in Hustville. About 500 people gathered to pay tribute and last respects to the beloved daughter, sister, friend and mentor. At that mournful moment, grief united all those present, forcing them to forget about quarrels and misunderstandings. At the entrance to the school, Lilie's students and colleagues created an improvised memorial in her honor. Next to it lay bouquets of her favorite flowers and farewell notes, the last signs of respect and honor to her bright memory. 14-year-old April Milsap, born on the first day of 2000, lived with her mother and stepfather David in the small town of Armada, Michigan. In the summer of 2014, she was a friendly high school student, a sociable and cheerful girl who dreamed of becoming a veterinarian. April's parents divorced when she was 6, but the girl quickly befriended her mother's new partner. April enjoyed drawing, walking with friends and her dog named Penny. She was dating Austin, a boy 1 year older, whom she met at school. By the age of 14, April was already independent and often walked the dog alone. The town of Armada, which at that time had a population of about 1,700 people, was considered very safe and cozy, where everyone knew each other by face. On July 24, 2014, April slept until lunch and then spent the whole day at the computer. Around 6 p.m., she decided to go for her usual walk with Penny, which typically lasted no more than an hour. However, an hour and a half passed, and the girl still hadn't returned. Her mother tried to call and text her daughter, but April didn't respond. The worried woman contacted Austin, thinking the young couple was together. But he replied that he hadn't seen April all day. None of the girl's friends knew where she was either. Half an hour later, there was a knock on the door. It was Austin with a friend who came to make sure April was okay. The boy showed April's mother an alarming message he received from the girl at 6:28 p.m., saying, "Someone tried to kidnap me." Jennifer immediately called her husband David, and the three of them rushed to search, knowing April's favorite routes well. Splitting up to cover more ground, they notified the police. Around 8:20 p.m., a couple of joggers stumbled upon April's frightened dog Penny with a leash. The dog ran away from people but stopped as if calling them to follow. Eventually, the dog led them to thick bushes where the girl's body lay in a ravine. It was difficult to recognize April. Soon, forensic experts and law enforcement officers from other regions arrived at the scene. After all, there were only 2 police officers in Armada, not prepared to investigate brutal murders, which were extremely rare here. None of them had ever encountered such crimes in this quiet town before. Due to the lack of resources for the investigation, the sheriff immediately sought help from more experienced law enforcement officers from surrounding areas. April's body was found at the bottom of a ravine. The girl was lying on her back, her shoes scattered a few meters away from her. The clothes and underwear were pulled down, indicating a sexual motive for the crime. However, further examination revealed no signs of rape. Investigators suggested that the attacker tried to do it but faced April's desperate resistance, or someone scared him off, possibly the dog or a random passerby. In any case, the girl was brutally beaten. Her body was covered with numerous bruises, from defensive wounds on her hands to a disfigured face. Forensic experts counted at least 48 separate injuries, mostly concentrated on the head and neck. April's head was covered in clotted blood, and there were signs of strangulation on her neck. But these were not typical marks from hands or any object. The strange prints on the victim's face and neck turned out to be shoe tread marks. The killer had trampled her and continued to stomp on her body. According to the forensic report, April's death was caused by trampling, which lasted over 10 minutes. Traces of a large shoe sole indicated that it was a heavy-set man. The girl died in terrible agony, her face so badly disfigured it was impossible to recognize. Only later was April identified by her clothes and jewelry by her relatives, who were searching for the missing girl just as the police were working at the scene. The bloody mess left of the girl's face shocked her loved ones, especially her mother. Jennifer, Austin, and his friend were immediately taken to the police station for questioning to form a circle of potential suspects and find out the latest events in the victim's life. April's mother was quickly ruled out as a suspect, while the police's attention turned to Austin. The young man said that recently his relationship with April had been strained, the couple often quarreled and was actually on the verge of breaking up. Shortly before the murder, they had another fight. Even more suspicion was aroused by the message April sent to her boyfriend before her death. She wrote that someone tried to kidnap her. However, Austin simply ignored this frightening text. Still, he insisted that he couldn't have done it because he received the message with a significant delay due to some glitch. In the detective's opinion, even after this, Austin's reaction was too sluggish. He didn't inform the police but just went to look for the girl himself. The young man explained that he was still offended by April after their fight and considered her text an attempt at manipulation to make him worry and be the first to reconcile. Austin didn't believe the situation was truly serious. Austin couldn't explain the reason for their last quarrel, blaming it all on the girl's incomprehensible behavior. This only intensified the investigators' suspicions, as it gave the boy a motive for the attack. Usually, such crimes are committed by the victim's partners. It was decided to detain Austin for further questioning. The police asked him to describe in detail how his day went to track the young man's movements and check his alleged alibi. Austin said that around 4 p.m., he met with a friend to help him bring a TV home. Then the buddies went to grab a bite at the nearest McDonald's. The boy's words were confirmed by the restaurant's CCTV footage. Austin was indeed there around 6:30 p.m., a few minutes after April sent the message about the attempted abduction. So the young man clearly could not have been involved in the murder of his girlfriend. Having cleared Austin of suspicion, the detectives decided to carefully examine the victim's cell phone, hoping to find messages from a possible stalker there. However, April's phone was missing from the crime scene. The killer likely took it with him, turned it off to avoid tracking, and threw it away somewhere else. A thorough search for the phone and other physical evidence along April's entire route, which involved dog handlers and even the FBI, initially yielded no results. But the next day, about a kilometer from the massacre site, the girl's mobile phone was found and sent for examination. Thanks to this, it was discovered that April had been actively texting with a schoolboy named Roger, known for his unpleasant character and frequent behavioral problems. However, he was soon also excluded from the list of suspects due to a confirmed alibi. Meanwhile, information about the brutal murder was disseminated through local media, urging possible witnesses who noticed something strange on the trail around the time of the crime to contact the police. However, for now, this only agitated the community of the small town and instilled fear in its residents. Everyone was afraid to leave home and let their children out on the street unattended, as the horrific killer was still at large. Not only the brutality of the attack was shocking but also the fact that it happened in broad daylight. No one felt safe anymore. Suddenly, a witness came to the police station with interesting information. The girl said that on the day of April's murder, around 6 p.m., she was sitting by the window of her house and noticed an unfamiliar white van slowly driving down the street. Two men were in the driver's and passenger seats. They seemed to be stalking someone, which immediately seemed suspicious to the girl. When the men noticed the witness in the window, they suddenly stopped and stared at her, pointing their fingers at her home. This made the girl nervous, after which the van drove away. Now, learning about April's murder, the witness was afraid that these two might be involved in the crime. Perhaps they saw the schoolgirl as easy prey and attacked her. The detectives found this information noteworthy. It was quite possible that the white van was indeed cruising the neighborhood in search of a victim, and the unfortunate lot fell to April. The police again appealed to the public, releasing a description of the van and sketches of the suspicious men, hoping to get more information. The very next day, two friends came to the station, confirming that they had indeed driven down that street that evening in the mentioned vehicle. The men are engaged in construction and renovation, and the van driver had previously done work in this area. He was just showing his partner the houses he had worked on, including the one where the witness lived. Their words were verified, and suspicion was lifted from them. The townspeople tried their best to help the investigation. A day later, several more people contacted the police, pointing to a suspicious motorcyclist. Eyewitnesses saw April walking the trail with her dog around 6:30 p.m., accompanied by an adult man pushing his motorcycle. They were just walking and talking. At that time, the witnesses thought it was the girl's father. He was behaving calmly, and April didn't look scared, so no suspicion arose. But now, given the circumstances, people began to doubt that man. None of the victim's relatives or acquaintances could identify him by description. Apparently, April was not familiar with him before. Judging by the witnesses' accounts, this meeting took place just when the schoolgirl texted her boyfriend about the failed abduction attempt. So suspicions about the mysterious companion only grew. There were few bikers in town, so this man's appearance drew the attention of locals. Moreover, the motorcycle had a rather unusual and rare blue and white color. The description was quite accurate. Just 3 days after the murder, on July 27, 2014, a motorcycle fully matching the description was found. It was parked near one of the houses in the city. When the police arrived there, the vehicle was still in place. A man tinkering in the garden said the motorcycle was not his but belonged to his 32-year-old friend James Van Callis. He lives in the neighboring town of Goodell's, 30 kilometers from Armada. The information was confirmed. On July 28, officers met with the bike owner to ask him about the events of the day April was killed. At first, James willingly cooperated with the investigation, agreeing to answer any questions. He claimed that he was at his friend's house in Armada that day, which his friend confirmed. But the police considered such an alibi unreliable, as the witness was a buddy who could cover for the criminal. And there were slight discrepancies in the timeline. The man was asked to provide the shoes he was wearing that day. He showed white sneakers, but their tread pattern did not match the marks on April's body, and there were no blood stains on them. There was a suspicion that these were not the right shoes. The detectives decided to find out more about James before crossing him off the list. It turned out that he had several convictions for nonviolent crimes, burglaries in 2005 to 2006 and non-payment of alimony. But while digging into the suspect's past, the police stumbled upon a more gruesome fact. James' father, James Van Callis Sr., was a registered sex offender. At that time, both men lived in the same house. The elder had been convicted of molesting a 13-year-old girl. It seemed that the father and son might have been involved in these crimes together. However, the focus was on the younger James, as witnesses saw a middle-aged man and later identified him specifically. A search of the suspect's house revealed a considerable amount of prohibited plants they were growing there. Both were arrested on drug distribution charges, which allowed the potential criminals to be isolated from society and the investigation to proceed calmly without fear of their escape. The police thoroughly checked all the shoes in the men's house, but no tread matched the marks on April's body. DNA tests on their clothing also yielded no matches. However, forensic experts were convinced that the motorcycle had been thoroughly washed with strong chemicals shortly before it was seized. Obviously, someone tried to wash away the evidence, apparently quite successfully. This theory was quickly confirmed by the younger James' girlfriend, Crystal. She said that on the day of April's murder, when she returned home, she found James carefully cleaning his shoes, motorcycle, and helmet with strong disinfectants. This aroused the woman's grim suspicions. The marks on April's head resembled helmet imprints. James was probably wearing it while torturing the girl. Crystal also reported that he had driven to his brother's house in the neighboring town that day, the same one where April lived. Crystal described in detail to the police the shoes James was wearing at the time, his favorite black and white Air Jordan sneakers. They were different from the ones he provided to the investigators during their first meeting. According to the woman, she never saw that pair again after that night. The criminal probably got rid of his favorite sneakers, fearing he couldn't wash away all the traces. Crystal also spoke about her relationship with James, describing him as a cruel and abusive man. Recently, she had felt like his hostage and property. James controlled literally every aspect of her life, even forbidding her to leave the house without his escort. At first, Crystal didn't trust him but was afraid he would kill her if she went to the police. Only after the arrest of the suspect's family was the woman able to testify safely. According to his own confession to his lover, James cleaned his things because he got them dirty with engine oil while repairing his motorcycle. But Crystal didn't believe him. To prove that the suspect really wore the mentioned shoes, the police found his photos from social networks where James was wearing sneakers identical to Crystal's description. Of course, he got rid of the pair he had on the day of the murder. But this did not prevent the investigators from buying the same model and comparing the sole pattern with the marks on April's body. Forensic experts immediately found an exact match. The girl was trampled to death in the very sneakers James had bought about a year before the attack. A check of the criminal's computer confirmed his unhealthy interest in much younger girls. He visited relevant websites. But the most valuable information was obtained from April's phone, which was analyzed in the FBI lab. The girl had a fitness app installed that tracked her speed, steps, heart rate, etc. Shortly after the alarming message to Austin about the attempted abduction, the app recorded a sharp acceleration of April. She was clearly trying to run away from someone. Apparently, that's when James drove up to her on his motorcycle and offered something, scaring the girl. She rushed to escape, but within a few minutes, the fitness tracker showed chaotic, excessively fast phone movements that lasted 10 to 15 minutes. This is how the app recorded April's last struggle for life, which she unfortunately lost. Later, the killer took the victim's phone and headed to his vehicle. The speed was now about 20 km per hour and remained so until the place a kilometer from the attack site where the gadget was thrown away. There were surveillance cameras on this route that captured James Van Callis on his motorcycle. The geolocation of the suspect's phone confirmed that during the murder, he was near the fateful trail. Doubts about his involvement in the crime were completely dispelled. The collected evidence was quite enough to charge James. But there was a problem: no direct evidence, such as the criminal's DNA on the victim's body, could be found. No matter how hard the forensic scientists tried, they found no traces of April's blood on the killer's belongings, equipment, or helmet. He had thoroughly cleaned everything and thrown it away. But despite the circumstantial nature of the evidence, its sheer quantity had to convince the jury. In October 2014, 3 months after the massacre, James was charged. The trial was scheduled for early 2016. The prosecution insisted that the man attacked the girl after she refused to have sexual relations with him. He had long been searching the internet for advice on how to seduce a minor, but all attempts failed. Unable to bear the rejection, the pervert brutally took revenge on the teenager. The defense predictably emphasized the absence of direct evidence of James' guilt, calling the prosecutor's arguments unconvincing. The defendant himself kept claiming his innocence. The lawyer even mentioned that his client had no previous problems with the law. But this was not enough to acquit the killer. After several hours of deliberation, the jury unanimously found James guilty of attempted abduction, rape, and first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. April's mother spoke at length at the sentencing. She was satisfied that the inhumane person who killed her daughter just for refusing him would never be released again. The woman couldn't believe that an adult was capable of such cruelty because of the neglect of their perverse desires. However, James never admitted his guilt, continuing to insist on his non-involvement in the crime. Immediately after the trial, he challenged the verdict by filing an appeal, but to no avail. He is still behind bars today. In memory of April, a memorial garden was laid out not far from the place of her death. A statue of the dog Penny was also installed there, as she led people to the body of her dead owner. Unfortunately, the faithful pet could not find help in time to save the girl's life. But thanks to Penny, it was possible to find and convict the brutal killer, who will never be able to harm another child. That's all for now. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Give this video a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any future content. Take care and goodbye.